operation. So I was, of course, escorted in the craft, and it was obviously made to be piloted by something smaller than the average human being, very cramped in there. There was a sub-level where a little collapsing floor member opened, and I could stick my head and upper torso down underneath with a flashlight to see how the gravity amplifiers hung upside down. Looked around the placement of the 3 seats, about 1/3 to 1/4 the size of a normal human seat. At one point when I was in the craft, one of the archways became transparent. There were some technicians working on something else that I had no knowledge of. So, and also something began to scroll up on the screen. So it might have been possible that the skin of the craft, whether under, electrical influence or something else, could at times become either transparent to look outside, or to some sort of video screen. That was pretty amazing. When I went outside and looked at it, it looked as if it was just a plain piece of metal again. A lot of people say, boy, it must have been exciting to go in there, and I always say it wasn't. It was a very ominous feeling. You really had because it's so, I know it sounds silly, but it's so unearthly in there. Nothing had a sharp edge to it. It was if the seats, the amplifiers that were in there, everything, as if it was made out of wax and heated for just a little bit and then cooled off. Everything had a smooth curve to it, even where a chair met the floor was blended into it. It was as if the entire craft was injection molded.
No one, let alone Bob Lazar, have been able to verify any of his academic or professional credentials. In 1990, he was convicted of pandering and declared bankrupt. In court, he simply described his occupation as a self-employed photo processor. Is Lazar a fraud? Did he work at S4? Or was he set up by the military to release certain information about the base?
The notion that he would make a great patsy and he's the perfect scientist to work on such a project is interesting science fiction. In the first place, we have no reason to say he's a scientist. No diplomas, no papers, no memberships, nothing. In the second place, I worked on security for 14 years. People take security far more seriously than that. One of the strange statements he's made, there are only 22 people working on this thing. Well, you get more than that working on devising a new mousetrap for the government anyway. That makes no sense. And, it has all the trimmings, his story, of a Walter Mitty story. Somebody in his imagination was, stronger, brighter, faster than anybody else.
I did a variety of research relative to Bob Lazar. I actually met him. I obtained a copy of his, what they call a W-2 form, which is one of the IRS documents associated with pay. His particular form indicated that he worked for the U.S. Department of Naval Intelligence. My investigation of this document and the claims that Bob Lazar made followed a very strict path of sound research. I contacted the U.S. Department of Naval Intelligence and indeed verified that they were likely responsible for presenting that W-2. I investigated the issue with the Internal Revenue Service. They informed me the exact words were, it appears to be legit, that it was a genuine document. It was not something that had been fabricated. There were a variety of numbers, contract numbers and so forth, issued on the document, which I was able to research, again finding that these were highly classified numbers. In fact, Internal Revenue Service ran into a brick wall when it came to trying to track down the actual employer associated with the document.
He gave me information about his background, educational background and employment background. I started with his claim to have worked at Los Alamos lab. I figured, well, that's a good starting point. If he worked at Los Alamos, it's pretty likely that he had an education somewhere. They don't just hire people off the street. And if he worked at Los Alamos, especially on classified projects, it's at least reasonable to assume he could have been hired somewhere else in Nevada to work on similar projects. We went to Los Alamos and got nothing even close to cooperation. They wouldn't respond to our phone calls. They say, we have no information on Bob Lazar. There's nothing in the files. I said, are you sure now? No, nothing in the files. I showed them the phone book entry that Bob had kept that said he was there. I showed him the newspaper article that showed that he was there. Are you certain that you don't have a Bob Lazar? Well, maybe we had a Bob Lazar. Here's an ID number, but he didn't work for us. He worked for someone else. Basically, Los Alamos Lab tried to thwart me at every step. Were completely uncooperative in trying to get information about Bob, and I found that to be the case at every step of the way in trying to verify his background.
I'm the one that couldn't find any records or anything. I mean, I'm the one that brought that up, because I was the first one to run into that. Initially, I couldn't get a hold of my birth certificate either, and that was one of the things that concerned me, is they might be trying to make me essentially a non-person.
I think it's most likely that Bob Lazar was indeed set up to be the conduit for certain information relating to this extraterrestrial project.
On one occasion in the desert, Bob Lazar saw a flying disc being tested.
I was brought into the hangar for one of the short-duration tests, and the craft was already outside on the lake bed, and lifted off silently and was drifted around for a bit and set back down, and that was pretty much of a marvelous sight. It's a huge thing. It's like seeing a house lift off the ground quietly. It's just, you can't imagine the energy involved to do that and not to make any noise at all. There was some audio communication with the craft, and so I can only assume that there were humans on board, and somehow they had managed to squeeze themselves into those little seats or put something in there to sit on, and obviously they knew how to operate whatever controls there was, or fabricate their own, or retrofit it with something.
The Apollo space missions of the 1960s stirred America into space fever. But as the country's finest astronauts hurtled skywards in conventional rockets, did the president know of the existence of sources and propulsion systems that were literally out of this world? Dr. Edgar Mitchell of the Apollo 14 mission and the sixth man to walk on the moon has carried out extensive investigations of the alleged saucer crashes, as well as the question of alien contact. He met Lazar in 1991.
I tend to believe that his basic story is true, that he was exposed to what he thought were alien craft and attempts to engineer and back engineer. I think that his explanation of what's going on and his theory that he's utilizing is probably not on target. What I think is credible is the fact that he was there. Since the Roswell incident in 1947, that there was a cover-up, that was a valid incident, and that there has been an active investigation program, reverse engineering program, and cover-up associated with that since that time.
After working at S4 for several months and in clear violation of his top-secret clearance, Bob Lazar decided to tell his closest friend, Gene Huff, about his work at the base.
My reaction was to, without pressing him against his will, find out more, get him to tell me anything I could. And it wasn't disbelief. I think I was actually motivated to further read, I started investigating other books on UFOs and other researchers' information to see if anyone knew anything, and needless to say, they didn't know what Bob knew.
1 month later, in March 1989, Bob Lazar went one step further. He decided to take his friends to the desert and show them a flying disc test.
I had remembered most of the days and times of testing. So I believe it was 8 or 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, somewhere in March '89, I believe. We went out with Gene Huff, my ex-wife, and John Lear. Shortly after the flight time that I had recorded, white light came up off the ground and hovered, and then began doing radical step maneuvers and darting from one side of the sky to the other, doing some impossible flight characteristics. But at times the craft had glowed tremendously bright, where we thought, being miles and miles away, we thought there was something wrong and the craft was going to explode, so much so that we all got behind the car.
It actually came closer. It came down the mountain range toward us to where we could actually see it was elliptically shaped. It looked like something that... It's strange to explain. It looks like an explosion that starts to explode and stops and doesn't explode and dissipate. That's how bright the light is. Your brain interprets it as an explosion about to happen.
On his third visit with his friends to observe the discs at night, Bob Lazar was arrested. He was taken to an unknown location for interrogation and never returned to Area 51.
They threatened